CO2 begins its journey in the atmosphere, where the plant will absorb it through the stoma. Zooming in on the plant makes the stoma visible to the naked eye.
After the CO2 enters the plant, it goes into a plant cell along with H2O. The plant absorbed H2O through its root system. Once in the cell, the CO2 and H2O head to the chloroplast.
Once both CO2 and H2O are in the chloroplast, they react to create glucose and oxygen. The energy for this reaction is provided from the sun. The reaction is called photosynthesis. After the reaction, the oxygen leaves the plant and goes to the atmosphere. However, the glucose monomers bond with other glucose monomers to form a starch polymer. This starch polymer stays in the cell to provide energy when needed. The plant will release enzymes to break down portions of the starch when needed.
Then, when an animal consumes that plant, it will also consume the starch that has been produced.
Once the plant is consumed, the salivary glands found in the mouth will begin to produce amylase, an enzyme used to break down starch into its monomer, glucose. The majority of the starch will be broken down once in the stomach. Then the glucose, amylase, and the remaining starch travel to the intestines.
Once in the intestine, amylase breaks down the starches that have not been already broken down. Amylase is also produced by the pancreas. Once all the starch is broken down, the glucose is able to be absorbed into the intestinal lumen along with sodium. Once in the lumen, the glucose is co-transported with sodium to a cell along a capillary vein. The sodium is going with the concentration gradient from high to low, so it pushes the glucose through along with it.
By zooming in on an individual cell, it makes it much easier to see how this code transport happens through the sodium-driven glucose port. Once the glucose and sodium enter the cell, they are pulled towards the cell's mitochondria. The cell also uses cellular respiration, so it will use some of the glucose that passes through on its way to the capillary. From there, glucose in that vein will go towards the glucose passive transport proteins and diffuse into a capillary vein. The capillary vein has a lower concentration of glucose than the cell, so that explains why the glucose passively transports. Then the sodium must leave the cell, so the cell maintains a lower concentration of sodium than the intestinal lumen, because if the cell has a higher concentration, sodium and glucose would not be able to enter the cell. The sodium leaves the cell through the sodium-potassium pump. The pump moves sodium out of the cell in order to maintain a concentration gradient, and the potassium is pumped into the cell. Potassium is used as an electrolyte, which keeps the electrochemical levels in the cell balanced. Once in the capillary, the glucose will flow to the other cells in the body.
When the body eats, the pancreas automatically produces and releases insulin into the bloodstream. When the insulin attaches to an insulin receptor on the cell, it triggers a reaction that allows the vesicle containing many glucose transport proteins to rise to the cell wall and integrate itself into the cell wall. Both the vesicle and wall are made of phospholipids, so they can easily integrate. Then glucose in the bloodstream can be absorbed into the cell through the glucose transport proteins. Without insulin in the blood, cells are unable to receive glucose. Once in the cell, the glucose goes to the mitochondria, where O2 is found in the blood, also will diffuse into the cell through passive transport and go to the mitochondria.
Once in the mitochondria, the glucose and the oxygen will react. This reaction creates ATP, CO2, and H2O. The water and ATP stay within the cell because these both are necessary for the cell's survival. Then the CO2 passively diffuses into the capillary vein and is then transported throughout the body till it reaches the alveoli in the lungs.
In the alveoli, oxygen that was breathed in absorbs into a capillary vein due to the concentration gradient. Then the CO2 diffuses from the capillary into the alveoli due to the alveoli having a lower concentration of CO2 than the capillary. The O2 is then transported throughout the body to fuel cells over again through the circulatory system.
Then the CO2 is released into the atmosphere, restarting the cycle of carbon throughout the ecosystem.